Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Saba, and I'll be your host this evening, representing IMC. We are really pleased to have you with us here today. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. This is a 60-minute session in total. The presentation will run first, followed by the Q&A in the last 15 minutes. Please keep your microphones on mute during the session. You're welcome to post any questions in the chat as we go. Please note that the session is being recorded. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Mr. Craig Alexander. Craig has over 30 years of experience in technology leadership, delivering transformational change across multiple industries, geographies, and culture, always with a strong human focus. He holds a master's degree from the University of Glasgow and has most recently worked in financial services, from fintechs to global banks, where his empowering leadership style has delivered significant results. Craig's passion for supporting others in their careers led him to founding Working Circuit in 2025, a career mentoring business rooted in real life experience rather than prescribed history. In today's session, Craig will share how pragmatic, experience based mentoring approach can promote humility, clarity, and meaningful growth for mentees. Craig, we are delighted to have you with us here today. Over to you.
Thank you, Saba. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Hello from Dubai. Ramadan Kareem, if you are celebrating that this month. Thank you to IMC for the opportunity to speak. I'm quite new to the mentoring game, so hopefully that might not shine through too much in this presentation. The point of my presentation this evening, particularly around the humility and clarity aspect, is there'll be a bit of a backstory to how I got to being a career mentor quite recently. Now, normally that wouldn't take up quite so much of a presentation, but for this one, it will actually take up 2 or 3 slides because it actually talks quite directly to how I actually work as a mentor and some of the experience that I bring to my clients. So forgive a couple of slides for a little bit of history, but there is an important point to it. Okay, so my contact details are there. I'll share them again at the end of the presentation. As Saba said, feel free to post questions as we go. We'll look to cover them off as much as possible towards the end. Okay, so a bit of an introduction. In terms of where I am as an individual at the moment, so this is my 31st year of employment post-graduation. I've worked mostly in technology and consulting, but also a lot in financial services in those years. I think I'm at my last count with my 12th organization. And I've worked, I've had the great privilege to be able to work in over 30 countries in that time, either as an employee or delivering as a consultant. I'm currently working at Commercial Bank of Dubai. I've been there around about 15, 16 months now. I am a technology portfolio lead. So after many years away from project management, I'm now back in project management. I manage some of the portfolios for the bank, including tech, finance, data, and AI. But alongside that, I started Working Circuit last year. So the career mentoring side business from which I derive a lot of personal fulfillment, and hopefully I'm helping quite a few others in the process. I'm going to go into a little bit of background now as to how that came about. So I do talk a lot about my own experience when I do the mentoring, but it's also not just from within the office environment, if you like, that I gain my experience. There's also a lot of peripheral experience within that as well, which is also very prescient and relevant, but also brings a lot of perspective to how I've worked in the last few years. So some relatively recent experience that inform how I've become a mentor, what sort of work I want to help people with, is that back in 2022, as can happen in any organization, there was a reorganization. I was at that time senior vice president for all of the service governance, and just prior to that, service operations, stability, that sort of thing for the second biggest bank in the Nordics. Um, and there was a reorganization, and I found myself without a seat at the table. It was one of those situations where the organization wanted me to stay. I just had to try and find a role within which to continue. I chose to leave, and that in itself was a learning experience. And for the next few months, looking for another role and learning some of the lessons from how the job market works today was a very, in hindsight, informing experience, but at the time, eye-opening, painful, difficult, challenging, all of those things. And that taught me a lot, that I hadn't really understood what that market was like since the previous time I'd looked for a role, which was 15 years earlier. And it told me the world had moved on, and that brought with it a lot of aspects to it. Um, it Overall, I wanted to make sure that if I could, I didn't want anyone else to go through that same experience if I could help them. I then subsequently moved thousands of miles to my next role here in Dubai. I'd been 6 years in Denmark. I moved here for my next role. That's where my journey took me. But that combination of experiences over 6 months was the first, if you like, foundational element to what then would ultimately become the mentoring that I was ultimately going to be doing. So, in terms of making that transition, not long after getting to Dubai, an aspect of Dubai is that it's very important to have a network. I wanted to establish one both from a social but also from a professional perspective, and getting into that networking environment and doing that fairly consistently on a weekly basis, combined with the 6 months prior to moving here, I did start to wonder how I could start to help others from my experience. There was an urge to want to not just use networking as a transactional experience, but also try to help others if I could. And I found myself in a situation where I was having conversations with others, whether it be over a drink or in a meeting or in a conference or whatever, that we'd start sharing ideas. And I found myself being able to help others more than they were helping me from an advice point of view. And so I started to think, how can I formalize this a little bit more? And so I took the step to take on a coach to start to formalize something that I knew there was something missing from my career. I couldn't figure out quite what it was. I went through some coaching for around about 6 to 8 weeks with a fantastic individual based in Canada, and I'm very happy to share her details if anyone's interested. And identified really what I was all about. It's termed my core four. So these are the four things around which I essentially thrive and best exist and perform in my life. Two of those were entitled Positive Impact and Leading Change. And so that resonated with what I've done both as a career, but was also then resonating very, very closely with what I was doing as part of the networking and helping others out. So that then led to the next phase, which was really my light bulb moment. And it's not a coincidence that the iconography for my from a mentoring site is that light bulb that you see on the screen. I figured out that maybe I should be doing this a little more formally, because the feedback I was getting was that people were getting good benefit from it, and maybe I could do this alongside the role I had in the bank. So that light bulb moment really then taught me from a formulaic point of view that if I could bring my experience, bring a real sense of purpose to the work, but also mentor with intent, that can derive both fulfillment and impact for both myself and for others. So this isn't just about me. This isn't just about others. This is very much a relationship aspect to the mentoring. And therefore, I started Working Circuit last year, having had quite a number of conversations on an informal basis. I turned that into something a little bit more formal. Working Circuit really came from an idea I had in connection to the light bulb, that there's an awful lot of electrical terminology can be very can correlate a lot with um, career situations and corporate terminology. So people have a certain amount of capacity, people are resistant to change, people can hold power, those sorts of things. So all of those simple terms can be used to explain things quite well when it comes to actually having conversations in a mentoring context. So that's the backstory to how we've got to the mentoring business. Now, alongside all of that, what's the first really important thing I wanted to sort of bring out in today's session was that um, it's very important from what I see and what I've experienced in a mentoring capacity, is that it's not really about the books, it's not really about the theory, it's not really about the training courses. Um, I've never been one to read very much in the corporate context. So I've never been one to talk about corporate theories. I've never been one to talk about explicitly using best practice to get things done. Give you an insight to my character a little bit. One of the most frustrating things I see on LinkedIn every summer is when countless executives will post a picture of their reading list for their summer holiday. And it's always 5 or 6 corporate books that they're going to be reading on the beach for the next 2 weeks. And I can't think of anything worse to do on a holiday than to read corporate books. That's what you do the other 50 weeks of the year. You don't do it when you're 2 weeks on the on 2 weeks on the beach with your family. So I've never really been one to get into that. It's been much more about learning from others, learning from leaders, learning from my peers, learning from my teams as to what good looks like. I've had to use best practice in many of my roles, but if I take project management as an example, the best project managers are not quoting pages, chapters, and subsections of a book to get their projects done. They're using their experience. They're using relationships. They're using metrics. They're using performance and that sort of thing to get things done. If they need to quote a book, then they're probably in a bit of a difficult situation. So from a mentoring point of view, it's not really just about the conceptual theories or any academic insight as to how you can be an effective mentor that will bring that humility and impact. The real world experience is much more relevant. Now, clearly, mentoring training is a very important aspect. I've undergone that. What it did for me is it helped frame my experience in the right way, that I could then convey my experience and explain and instruct and suggest and those sorts of things for my clients, but not be too prescriptive when I was doing it. I bring a very specific sense of experience and reality to what I talk about. And what that does is it brings out my character much more clearly, and it really reinforces the personality on the conversation. And that for many people can resonate quite well. And everyone's obviously their own individual. Everyone has their own personality, but regardless of what it is, whether you're an extrovert, introvert, informative, educational, whatever it is, that is very, very key in any mentoring that takes place. And I'm particularly passionate about that aspect. Um, I've seen enough and done enough in my corporate career that I know what works. I know what good behavior looks like. I know what good practice look like. Equally, I know what um, the bad side of that is as well. And I've learned from that. I've learned from that in my own personal experiences as well. And I'm going to touch on that in a second, just to give you a little more specifics around where I've come from and the sort of things that I've learned. So um, all of those combined allows a really good level of empathy to be shown to clients. So bringing the theory, bringing your personality, and bringing your experience all into the same place. So we talk in practical terms about what that means. Just to sort of re-emphasize that real world experience that drives humility in oneself when I'm mentoring. But in doing so, it tends to bring the client out into the open a little bit more. They'll start to reveal things, they'll start to share things a little more openly than they otherwise would do, because they're able to relate in real terms what they might be going through or what they need advice on or what they're challenged on with anything that I can talk about obviously without naming names or companies, but I can talk to very specific experience. So I don't mind sharing here that I have been fired in the past. I've been made redundant twice. I've been passed over for promotion. I've worked on projects that have been an absolute waste of time, sometimes for months on end. And I've had some pretty toxic bosses in the past. But at the same time, I've worked with fantastic colleagues. The success I've had as a leader is not down to just what I've been able to do. It's predominantly down to the people I've been working with and who I've had working for me that allow me to lead them in such a way that great results can be achieved. Within that, I've seen my teams grow. There's nothing I love more than one of my people getting taken by another team and for a promotion, or growing in their own role or anything like that. That's what I really get the stimulation from. I've been unexpectedly promoted. The SVP role I had in Denmark, I had absolutely no idea it was coming. My perception of my own performance was so-so. Others' perception was much more positive. That's something that can also come out in mentoring conversations. I've delivered some fairly significant projects. I've had to close regulatory orders. I've transformed organizations with hundreds of people. I've moved hundreds of people from one company to another. Um, and a lot of that was done at a very young age. I've been very fortunate to be put in positions where I could work with great people and be empowered to do great things on my own. But probably most proud is that I've become a leader of people in such a way that I've seen others thrive. I like to coach them. I like to mentor them, and that's where the link from the corporate world into the mentoring world really comes in. I can talk in very similar ways to clients as I can to my own teams, and because I'm coming from a very clear position of genuine intent, genuine experience, and therefore a position of integrity. So, in short, that brings balance and perspective. You pair that with my own character and personality. That really then provides for a genuine human approach in a mentoring capacity, and I can see a lot of good resonance coming back from that. So if I want to build on what that looks like in a client career situation, I'll go into a bit more detail on this slide against the points that I've noted here. So if I bring that real world experience from my own from the world that I've had to work in, the various organizations, the different industries, the different locations, the different geographies, whatever it is, there's a multitude of situations, and there's a lot of anecdotal stories or lessons learned I can bring, often from the same project. I have one particular project in my past from which I've not only had my best friend, I've met my best friend, but I've seen significant stress in others. I've seen wastes of money. I've seen changes of leadership. I've seen all aspects just come from one individual project. But more broadly, if I think back to those points I made on the previous slide in terms of performances, in terms of projects, in terms of people, there's half a dozen situations here which are very common to a lot of people with whom I meet, and for whom I'm able to provide quite a bit of guidance, quite a bit of stimulation, quite a bit of a suggestion in terms of how they might want to therefore move forward themselves. And take things a little more into their own hands and take charge of their next steps. So if we go through these in a little bit more detail. So performance reviews are a factor of corporate life. We all have to do that every year. Different companies have different interim steps, whether it be quarterly or mid-year reviews, and there are different grading systems and things like that. And so everyone typically has in that situation a set of objectives. They tend to be classed as SMART, with that acronym being applied for specific, measurable, accurate, relevant, and timely. And we've all, a lot of us have been there. We know what it means. But not everyone understands that your performance review is never only about your objectives. It's also about all of the peripheral behavior you exhibit in your role throughout the year. It's also about, for example, who you meet, who you are able to influence, who you're polite to in the lift in the morning, who you happen to know that is a contact of an influential figure. So in those conversations, whether it be getting ready for an end of year review or setting objectives for a year, the conversations I can have with a client will talk about, it's not just about your objectives. What else have you done? Who else are you making relationships with? Even if they're not part of your direct role, who can you see as an influential figure? Who can you do a joint project with? Who might you be doing something socially with? Thinking about your existence in a corporation in the round, in totality, not just in your own role, and delivering to your line manager and working with your own team. That's a very important scenario for people to understand. So if I meet someone who's frustrated with their end of year performance rating and they're trying to equate grades and marks to each of those objectives, it's very important to have the conversation, well, what else have you done? And also, are you aware of how you perform against others in the team? Now, not everything around that is in your own control. Sometimes it can be done subjectively, and politics can play a part. But the more self-aware a client, someone can be around things for the performance review, but at the start, end, and all the way through a performance year, the better they will be able to perform, and the better chance they'll have of getting a good grade at the end. That's the first one that's a very common situation for clients. The next one in the current market, as I'm sure many of you are aware, it's pretty tough out there. The job search process is both frustrating and lengthy, as well as there being, fewer roles. There are more candidates. There's lots of automation in the process, that sort of thing. So when it comes to someone being in a situation where they're either sensing that redundancy might be coming, or they're coming to an end of a contract and they don't have something else lined up, or they've been told that they're likely to be made redundant, or whatever that particular difficult situation might be, it's very easy to get negative. It's very easy to get familiar with what you already know and not be open-minded about things. So having been in that situation on a number of occasions in the past, and speaking with a lot of people in the market, one of the groups of people with whom I network a lot are recruiters, both from just a general. I happen to meet with them generally anyway, but also I look to help some of them. I'm very happy to promote people that I know to recruiters that I trust, that helps them with their efforts to find good candidates. So I look to work with people who are facing some uncertainty in their role, because I know it can be very challenging. But think back to what I mentioned at the start of the presentation around the time it took me to find another job after I chose to leave the bank in Denmark. I understand the feelings that can be experienced during that process. Prior to that, I never understood what imposter syndrome was, for example. I absolutely know what it is now. So I recognize it in people I speak with very easily. It's very easy to get down, get negative about the job search if it's moving on and not really getting it anywhere. So that's a very important point to cover off. So having been there myself, clients tend to get a good sense of an understanding that I have for them in that situation, and therefore the conversation opens up, and we can have very frank discussions about what a redundancy might look like, especially in certain regions where visas might be part of the situation. Here in Dubai, as an expat, for example, if you don't have a golden visa and you don't find another job, you have to leave the country within 4 months. So that is a very, very stressful situation for some people. So I always try to look out for people in that situation, and try and help them if I can. Alongside the mentoring, I am quite proactive when it comes to connecting people for other roles. One of the most positive experiences I've had in the last week, and there was a post on LinkedIn about this a couple of weeks ago, where I was able to make a match between a job vacancy I saw advertised from someone I didn't know and someone I know who was looking for a role in just that particular market. From me seeing the ad, making some connections, making some phone calls, to the individual I was looking out for getting an interview, took 60 minutes. I was really happy about that. That sort of thing is a really good example of something from which I get really good fulfillment. I really enjoy that situation, because it's a sense of doing the right thing. It's a sense of um, good things happening to good people, helping out the hiring manager without looking for hundreds of candidates. They look for a strongly recommended one. That sort of thing really gets me fired up. So anything I can do in that space, I want to help. Just in the last week, there's a role advertised in my own organization. I've been able to put forward 2 or 3 candidates for that, which I've recommended, and those are people that I know are looking for something something good. So it's really good to be able to make those connections. Just building a bit more on the job search part, it is a very difficult situation for many at the moment. The market across the world is really challenging. I've particularly strong opinions when it comes to how the job search should go. I think there are certain things that are really positive in the modern way of looking for a job. I think equally there are things which are absolutely ridiculous and terrible and really do not help either the candidates, the hiring managers, or the organizations. I think there's so many improvements that can happen there. So whilst those are things that are not things I can personally control, I can help candidates control what they can control in their own search by being visible, by having a good CV, by having good LinkedIn profiles, by doing networking, those sorts of things. I can help them with that situation. Some other things out with performance and job searching is that I often come into contact with people who genuinely are lost in their role and need to do something different. And they don't really have all the answers, and the people with whom they work or they're related to don't necessarily put themselves in a position where they can provide truly objective opinions. A mentor can do that. A mentor can start asking a little more objective questions and start drilling into what the cause for the want to pivot is, what really drives them. And here's where I can use my coaching. I can use the questions that I was put through a couple of years ago to determine what I wanted to do. I can use those lessons learned. I can use those techniques and try and extol them with the client, and they can start asking open questions. Really start trying to delve into what it is that's driving them. Really, what their sense of purpose is going to be. Really, where they want to head in the future. Now that pivot can come from a positive standpoint. It can come from, I've done some great things so far. Now what's next, and where they can go to after that. But it can also come from a very negative standpoint in terms of being fed up with what they've been doing for the same role for a number of years. Whether they're struggling to get past a certain position or whatever it is, or they've seen colleagues or friends do something different that worked for them, and they've been inspired to do the same. So there's a lot of work we can do through that. I was able to make some changes early in my career in going from consultancy into banking. That was a huge change. That was a huge transformation. A very stressful period in my career. But having gone through that, I was able to look back on that with a good deal of objectivity, and there's a lot of lessons came out of that as well. And I can bring those into those sorts of conversations for anyone wanting to pivot. In a more kind of sort of realistic situation in an office, very often people are not necessarily able to handle difficult colleagues, whether that be their manager, whether that be peers, or having difficult staff that are working for them. Their personality maybe doesn't allow them to easily work with these people, or they're not used to a certain culture or anything like that. Having been around different companies, different cultures, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't. Not everything. I'm not completely all knowing on that, but I've seen a lot. I've seen enough to be able to provide some guidance with that in terms of what works and what doesn't, what they can control and what they can't. That can provide some really good objectivity for my clients in that regard. And we have really good, healthy conversations in that. Last example is around. I've met with a number of people in the last year, in particular, who are either about to start a brand new role and are nervous and want to know how to handle that, or have landed themselves in a brand new role and have a real sense of being lost. It's either it's not quite what they were expected, or it's overwhelming, or all of a sudden they now have significantly more responsibility, or whatever it is. That can be a very stressful time, very challenging period. I've had one particular situation where one of my clients has found themselves in a situation, but they've been asking questions where they actually think they're vulnerable, and they described a situation where they're working for a manager who doesn't like them skipping a level and going to their superior, going two up in the organization, having direct conversations. So you have if like a controlling or a micromanaging manager in that situation, but at the same time, a very senior director in another part of the organization is wanting to have direct conversations with this individual. They find themselves therefore in a bit of a crossroads situation where who do I please? Because whatever I do, I'm going to upset somebody. The reality of that situation was not that they're vulnerable, was that actually they're in a very powerful position because you have a very senior individual seeing talent and seeing capability in a more junior individual. That should be able to reflect very well on their manager and their manager's manager in terms of the talent they have in their team. So we talked around that particular scenario, how best to get them working together and moving forward. And after a couple of conversations, things seem to be moving in the right direction. So it's very often the case where a client is in a situation where they don't really know what to do next, but with a couple of simple questions and statements, things become very, very clear. It's that same I would for the trees. It's very easy to get lost and be insular in that experience especially within a corporate environment. And so bringing that comparable situation example, bringing the here's what I've seen in the past situation, that can really help clients, and therefore it drives a lot more clarity from the discussion rather than theoretical outcomes. It brings some real determinable actions. So alongside those situations, there is obviously an element of pragmatism and above all empathy required from a mentor. So I've talked about how I use comparable experience, whether it be with certain people or particular organizations or particular project types or the geography. We can make connections between myself and the client in terms of what that looks like. So the world of financial services has a particular way of working. There are certain cultural aspects that are universal across the globe, but equally regionally there are different ways of working. So here in the Middle East, it's quite different to how it works in Europe, for example. And I've been able to see both ways, and therefore I can make some comparable experiences, especially for example, clients who are moving here. That's a very typical situation for my clients. They're moving to the Middle East. They want some advice as to how best to get started, how best to integrate with their new organization. But whatever is that comparable situation, there is a different level of sensitivity required depending on the situation. So as I've talked about, that redundancy or job searching is a very, very stressful situation. Therefore, that requires a very good degree of integrity and sensitivity in those conversations. At the same time, I meet with clients who have a relatively good idea of what they want to do. They're just looking for some additional ideas or some pointers. And if they're coming across very, very positive, the last thing a mentor should be doing is doing anything to reduce that positivity. If anything, they should be looking to enhance it and provide them more impetus into what they want to be doing moving forward. From a conversational point of view, I tend to speak in the first and the third person. So I talk about myself and others. I don't tend to talk about you. So it's not directional, it's not directive, the conversation that I have. It's advisory, and therefore talking in the third person becomes much more appropriate to the discussions that I have. But above all, to drive that humility, drive those results, drive those pragmatic ideas in clients. It's about being genuine, honest, and specific, not being theoretical, not talking about theoretical situations. Being able to provide specific examples, I find, really does drive that clarity. It makes the conversation much more relatable. I have a habit of when I book my client calls, of them never ever only lasting as long as they're booked for. The conversation always tends to go on for longer, but that's a really good sign in some ways, because it means that there's a good connection, that there's a good way of relating, and therefore the client's getting a lot more out of the discussion. Alongside all of that, being visible as a mentor is also very important. Not really just from a business point of view. I'm not really talking about it from that perspective. But having a voice on LinkedIn, for example, how you present yourself as a mentor needs to be consistent with how you are as a mentor with your clients. There's no point in putting out theoretical posts or clickbait online and then be a completely different personality when it comes to speaking with people. So, as an example, my imagery tends to focus either on anything around a sunset or a sunrise. You've seen that in the previous pictures. But I also bringing a lot of pop culture references into my post as well. So, and the reason I do that is I do that in my work as well. So, in some of the more senior roles I've had in the recent past, one of them was, for example, head of IT operations. So I was the accountable executive for when there was any significant incident at the bank I worked for. And that can be a very, very significant situation depending on what's happened. So, for example, I've been forefront for a 24-hour outage of the bank systems. That requires a very good, strong level of leadership. But equally, I'm the one to bring a little bit of humor or lighten the mood within those stressful situations if I need to. Okay, so in the example of Dumbledore there, that's a post where essentially is we're saying what are we doing? That post is being a little more negative in its outlook for hiring tips, but the point being it's meant to be a little more humorous rather than me posting an executive with his arms folded. I'd much rather bring something in a little more humorous to lighten the tone, but still make the serious point. So I personally use a mix of these images, and I bring in the if you like the serious part, but also alongside humorous or pop culture references within the conversation to make it a little more flowing, a little more fluid, a little more lighthearted. A mentoring conversation is by default serious, but it doesn't have to be so serious that it becomes a little too formal. It's the same way I work in leading my teams. I will drop pop culture references in 2 or 3 times a day just to be a little more realistic with my team. It allows my team to relate to me a little bit more easily. It brings out the personality and how we execute, and it always portrays to the team that they're able to execute, and I've got their back. But we're not going to be too serious about it. So I make that point there because I bring my own personality out and how I work both online, but also with the client meetings themselves. So just beginning to wrap up the slides. So some takeaways from my own experience. So first and foremost, you're as good a mentor as you are a listener and an effective communicator. That active listening aspect is something that's very, very important. It was not a term with which I was familiar until about 4 years ago, when someone else in the family was doing some coaching, and it was a point that was put across to them, and I did realize in my earlier years that was not something that I was very good at. I'm not great at it now, but I'm a lot better than I used to be, and that's a very, very important aspect as a mentor. As I mentioned earlier on, the research and study around mentoring can only really complement your own experience. What you've experienced in your own careers and broader life, if appropriate, can really inform others. So apply the mentoring theory to your own life and bring that out, and that integrity and that humility really can shine through. Be yourself. Bring your personality to what you do in your mentoring role, because that provides a genuine view of how you are as an individual, and people tend to resonate with that rather than with a lack of personality. And finally, make sure that your messaging that you're putting out there online is the same as it is when you're having a conversation with your clients. Being consistent, being demonstrative, being rigorous in your approach, being consistent is very, very important when it comes to the mentoring side of this. So that's all slides for now, Saba. Thank you. We have time for questions. those are my
Yeah.
contact details there. The QR code will take you to theworkingcircuit.com. If you want to know more about what I do, there's some information there. And if you want to book a meeting, there's a meeting link through my calendar link on the website. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Craig, for the insightful and practical session. We'll now move to our Q&A segment, which we'll run for the next 10-15 minutes. So the participants are free to post, in the chat box, and Craig will answer those questions for you. So, Craig, I have asked a question in the chat box about the
Mhm.
techniques that will help, the mentees gain more clarity. Because there are a lot of times, where the mentees are also feeling overwhelmed or stuck. So, how do you move past that? Like, how do what techniques will help them?
Mhm. Well, I start with trying to understand really what the trigger for that particular situation is. So,
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that I talk from a more kind of positive point of view of if someone has a goal, what was the trigger for having that goal? I always want to go back to what is the trigger for perceiving where someone is now? Because it may be that it's just a perception; it's not actually reality. There's this phrase that the beliefs are not facts. So, is it a belief the individual has, or is there actual factual evidence to support what they're sensing at the time, and therefore they're feeling stuck, as you say. So, I would take it back to that what trigger, and then between what that trigger is and where they are now, what's happened in the interim, and that provides a bit of clarity in terms of okay, so there's this particular company or that particular individual or this particular project or this particular situation or whatever it is, the around which the sense has gravitated, and then we'll go into that a little bit more and try and then take that forward and extrapolate that out into what it could be carrying on the current approach that they have, or if adopting additional ideas or tactics where with different direction that could go in.
Thank you so much. Anyone has any questions, feel free to post. I believe that nobody has any more questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to thank Craig for coming over here, sharing his experiences, the perspectives, and so openly today in front of everyone. And I would like to thank everyone who joined us in the contribution to this discussion.